Okay, so what is the actual initiation of labor? All right, so estrogen is going to reach its peak during the last bits of pregnancy. That's going to stimulate the placenta to release prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are going to weaken the cervix. Okay, this estrogen will also increase the number of oxytocin receptors. Remember that permissive effect that we talked about with the endocrine system? So estrogen will input more of these oxytocin receptors into the uterus so that when the baby's head reaches that birth canal and there's a release of oxytocin, it'll have a greater effect. There may be some weak contractions that take place, but it's going to be the corticotropin releasing hormone that is being secreted by the placenta that is sort of the clock that establishes the timing of birth. There is an emotional and physical stress as the head enters the birth canal. So again, as this cervix is weakened and the corticotropin hormone kind of sets that now kind of signal, that will set up a positive feedback loop that releases more oxytocin, which causes more contractions and stretching, which causes the release of more oxytocin, which causes more contractions and stretching, and so on and so forth. This positive feedback loop. So from the onset of labor until the cervix is fully dilated is considered the dilation stage. Initial contractions can be anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes apart and fairly short in duration. Again, the cervix is going to efface and dilate. This is where the amnion ruptures, releasing the fluid. That's when people say my water is broken. That's what they're talking about. And then the head is entering into this pelvic area, right? Again, lots of feedback loop going on with oxytocin. The expulsion stage is from the full dilation stage to delivery of the infant. Now contractions are more frequent. So this is when you see in movies or TV shows, how far apart are the contractions? But that's what they're trying to get to, is the shorter the time between contractions, the closer you are to actual childbirth, like child coming out of the female. And they're going to, so not only are they faster in between one another, but they last longer. There's also an urge to push that's going to increase. And then crowning is when you can actually see the top of the baby's head. And you'll notice from this image to this image how the baby actually has to kind of like twist a little bit to get out of that birth canal. Continuing on the expulsion phase or this expulsion stage, the placenta or the afterbirth needs to also be removed. That has to happen fairly quickly after birth. If it is not, the female is at risk of bleeding out or bleeding to death. So that will detach. So again, the blood vessels here in the uterus can clamp off. Otherwise, if they don't, there's no way for the blood vessels here to clamp off. And again, the female will just simply bleed out. Okay. So for the baby, its first breath, since it is no longer receiving the exchange of gas via the placenta, the carbon dioxide is going to build up. That's acidosis, if you remember back to that pH lecture. That acidosis will cause the respiratory centers of the medulla to trigger the first breath in. You don't have to go around slapping babies, okay? It will do this naturally. That does require quite a bit of effort. That is the first time these tiny little lungs are going to breathe in air. They are collapsed, so it does take quite a bit for that baby's first breath. But once they are inflated, the surfactant will help reduce surface tension, so any breath thereafter is much easier. So changes to the circulatory system, I mentioned some of these to you already. So again, that ductus arteriosus becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. That foramen ovale becomes the fossa ovalis. That ductus venosus is going to degenerate into a round ligament. It's also called the ligamentum venosum. There is a transitional period, as you can imagine, going from a very consistent, warm, soundproof, light-proof environment to, external air touching skin, noises being much louder than I'm sure they were before. There's a transitional period, so this is about 6 to 8 hours after birth for the newborn. Basically, the baby will be active for short bursts and then kind of fall asleep, active, fall asleep. Not surprisingly, the heart rate is going to be fairly elevated, so is the respiratory rate. The body is trying to figure out thermal regulation, didn't have to do that before. There's a second activity stage is going to occur after the first time it falls asleep, where the baby will then regurgitate any remaining mucus and debris. And again, it'll wake, sleep about every 3 to 4 hours. We mentioned to you meconium. So this is the first stool. It should not be so the baby should not be releasing meconium inside the amniotic sac. If it does, that's a sign of distress. It is going to be its first stool is almost entirely of this meconium. Which is this really weird tarish, greenish, black stool. It will later transition to a slightly more yellow color, well, a much more yellow color than what it was, based on what the milk that it is receiving from the mom. So as for the female, right, lactation is going to be the production of milk by the mammary glands. Estrogen, progesterone, now lactogen is going to stimulate the release of prolactin by the anterior pituitary. The very first milk that is being produced by mom is called colostrum. It is particularly rich in vitamin A, protein, minerals, and antibodies. So you can see the first few days of production is this colostrum type of milk, after which it is followed with true milk production. And so again, after birth, milk production will be stimulated by the suckling of the infant. So you can see the stimulation of mechanoreceptors in the nipples is going to send impulses to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will send impulses to the posterior pituitary, where oxytocin is stored. Oxytocin is then going to be released from the posterior pituitary, which will stimulate cells of the breast to contract. That will cause milk to be released, right? And that's a positive feed mechanism until the baby stops suckling. There's lots of advantages to breast milk and to breastfeeding. Obviously not every female is going to produce enough, so we do have lots of formulas available at the same time. However, there are some advantages. Fats and irons are more easily absorbed. The amino acids are more efficiently metabolized than the milk of other animals. There are lots of beneficial things that are present, so immunoglobulins, again, that IgA, complement proteins, lysozymes, interferons. If you remember any of these are all going to be things that are going to help keep the baby healthy and prevent it from getting sick. There are interleukins and prostaglandins that are present, which will help with any kind of inflammatory response, as well as some natural laxatives. All right, this is pretty short, so I think I'm just going to continue on to some of the things that could possibly go wrong. This is a fairly short section, and again, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. We're just going to touch the surface with a few, but just a few of them. Sometimes individuals have difficulty becoming pregnant, whether that's due to infertility on the male's part or on the female's part. So sometimes in vitro fertilization has to be performed for a couple to have a child. So in this case, an egg is extracted, and as well as sperm. And what you'll see here is that usually what they'll do is in a petri dish, they will simply combine the sperm and egg in the petri dish, allow the sperm to naturally find the egg and fertilize it, and then the fertilized egg will then be implanted into the endometrium. Sorry, so many words all at the same time wanting to come out of my mouth. Ever so often, if the problem is more with the sperm where they cannot swim, they have to be injected into the egg, and that is also a possibility. So we do have that technology. Until recently, we would have the case of individuals having multiple pregnancies resulting due to in vitro fertilization, because they would have to implant multiple fertilized eggs to ensure that one of them would implant correctly. Today, the technology today is much better. So you can see this, the IVF industry caps the number of embryos that can be transferred per cycle at 2. This, again, reduces the risk of multiple births, like Octomom, if any of you remember that. How are twins formed? Well, we can have identical twins or fraternal twins. So in the case of identical twins, it is one sperm, one egg, so you have the exact same genetic information. And then somewhere during the cell division stage, it splits into 2 separate placentas, 2 separate individuals. In the case of fraternal twins, those are 2 totally different eggs, each with its own unique genetic information, along with 2 different sperm. So fraternal twins can look very, very different. They can even be different genders. Okay, because again, they've got different genetic information. Sometimes you may have conjoined twins. So in this case of identical twins, depending on when the split occurs, you'll notice here if it's at the morulus stage, the solid ball stage, you can have 2 individuals with separate placentas, separate amniotic sacs. Later, if it's occurring at the blastocyst stage, it is now 1 placenta with a split sort of one amniotic sac with a dividing wall. Later on, once it's implanted, it occurs. You have 1 placenta, but you now no longer have a separator between the 2. Sometimes this can be dangerous as the umbilical cord of one developing fetus wraps around a body part of another, including the other one's neck, and that can be deadly. And if it occurs after the embryonic disc is formed, that it's believed that is how conjoined twins occur. So at this point, the division can't fully separate into 2 full different people. So they're usually conjoined at some body part. You may have heard of placenta previa. So what you're seeing here on the left, this is the normal location of the placenta. In placenta previa, part of the placenta is actually covering the cervix. That can cause spontaneous miscarriage or premature birth, or bleeding, or rupture of the amniotic sac. Any of those things, because it's covering that cervix, it is not structurally sound, so it can cause some problems during the pregnancy. In ectopic pregnancy, so again, here you see normal, this is going to be implanted somewhere in the uterine wall. Ectopic, it is implanting in the fallopian tube. There's lots of misinformation going on out there. You cannot just take a fertilized egg that is implanted in the fallopian tube and reimplant it somewhere else. This is not a viable pregnancy. This will kill the female. Okay, so an ectopic pregnancy is very dangerous. Preeclampsia is an abnormal condition characterized by sudden hypertension or very high blood pressure. Blood pressure that is so high that there's actually protein that's being found in mom's urine, because blood pressure is so high that those filtration membranes are not strong enough to prevent these things from being filtered out. There's swelling. If it's bad enough, they may do that high blood pressure. You may have blurred vision as well as headaches. When preeclampsia is not controlled, you can see so it's pre-eclampsia. Eclampsia can occur, which is basically all of this plus seizures can develop, and again, that can be deadly for mom. So it's a serious condition. Microcephaly. So sometimes there are developmental anomalies that occur, and the baby's head does not form correctly. There's nothing that can be done. And let me say, this is a permanent thing. It's not like this will ever grow later on. This can be either with some microencephaly or severe microencephaly. Rarely do individuals live very long after birth with this. I mean, some live longer than others. Some of this can be due to the Zika virus. You may have heard of that. That is borne by mosquitoes. So take a look. There's a little bit more information about this. But obviously, this is going to cause some severe developmental deficiencies. Spina bifida is another one. There's different types of spina bifida. Depending on how much of the spinal cord is growing outside the normal spinal column will determine how much of a detrimental effect it has. So you can see spina bifida occulta is a small gap in the spine, but no opening or sac in the back. Usually there's no deficit here. In meningocele, the fluid is out. It's actually like on the surface. It looks kind of like a little bubble on the surface. But the spinal cords are still like in the normal spinal canal. There's either little or no nerve damage. And then here where we have the part of the spinal cord going outside of the body, usually that will result in some paralysis occurring. This is all due to neural tube defects, usually due to not having enough folic acid. Right, so if you hear about women being told to make sure they have enough folic acid or take folic acid supplements, this is what they're trying to prevent. All right, hopefully that makes sense to you all. And I'll just have one last bonus slide for you. Let's see, back now, quite a few years ago, about 7 years ago, they successfully grew a sheep in a plastic bag. So you can kind of see that one that mimicked the amniotic fluid. So the idea here is that this would help premature babies, right? So instead of them, I mean, you've all seen like those severely premature babies that can't quite make it. If there's a way that if they're born and then there's a way to put them into an artificial uterus that they can then continue to develop and be removed when their organs are more developed and have a higher chance of survival. All right, so that's it for development. That's it for this course. That's all the lectures I have for you, for a lecture at least. And as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.